Harper Calloway thought she had already lost everything there was to lose. Her daughter, her husband, her home, her dignity. All that remained was a worn suitcase, her mother's old recipe book, and a silent vow never to let her heart attach to anyone again. On the other side of Montana's endless dirt roads, a family was also falling apart, a powerful man drowning in his own silence, 2 children learning to survive without the sound of their mother's voice. It was supposed to be just a job. But some houses don't just need someone to cook and clean. They need someone to teach them how to breathe again. There are days when people wake up and don't quite know why. Harper woke because her body stirred on its own, because the morning light slipped through the curtains without asking permission, because the world kept spinning whether she wanted it to or not. But the will to live that hadn't come for a long time. 3 years since she buried her daughter. 2 years since she buried her husband. No one should ever have to bury a child. Everyone knows that. But knowing changes nothing. If this story touched your heart, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss what happens next. Miriam's old car rolled slowly along the red dirt road, dust rising behind it like unspoken farewells drifting into the open air. Harper sat in silence in the passenger seat, her eyes fixed on the endless stretch of Montana fields beneath the heavy gray sky of October. The low hills were covered in dry, yellowed grass, here and there broken by a solitary oak standing alone against the horizon. The landscape was beautiful in a sorrowful way, like a painting someone had finished and then quietly abandoned. Miriam glanced at her, her aging eyes filled with concern, yet she didn't speak for the first 10 minutes. She had been Harper's mother's friend, the only person who still kept in touch with her after everything that had happened. When her husband's family had thrown her out onto the street, Miriam had been the only one to open her door and take her in. And now she was the one who had found this job for her. Harper was grateful, but she had forgotten long ago how to say thank you. At last, Miriam spoke, her voice hoarse as though she were weighing each word carefully. "Killian Ashford," she said, "owns nearly half this county. His wife died last year from illness. 2 children, a boy and a girl. The house is large, but the silence inside it is larger." Harper didn't reply. She only gave a small nod. She didn't need to know more. She only needed a place to stay, a job to do, and enough money to disappear after 3 months. Miriam sighed and tightened her hands on the steering wheel. "He isn't a bad man, Harper," she continued. "He's just broken. Broken." Harper understood that word better than anyone. She had lived with brokenness for 3 years, had learned how to breathe when her chest felt crushed beneath invisible weight, had learned how to walk when her legs didn't want to move. She wasn't afraid of broken people. She was only afraid that she would try to mend them. The car turned onto a narrower road, old wooden fences lining both sides. Then suddenly the scenery changed. A large iron gate stood ahead, at least 3 meters tall, security cameras mounted on both sides. 2 men dressed in black stood guard, their faces as cold as stone. They peered into the car, examined it for a moment, then opened the gate without a word. Harper felt a chill creep along the back of her neck. This wasn't an ordinary ranch. She knew that immediately. Farmers didn't need guards dressed in black. Ordinary families didn't need fences 3 meters high with barbed wire coiled across the top. But she didn't ask. Miriam had warned her, and Harper didn't want to know. Knowing more only meant more trouble. The car continued for several minutes, along a white gravel drive that wound between towering pine trees. Then the house appeared at the end of the road, and Harper had to admit she held her breath for a second. It was a country-style mansion, vast and imposing, with a roof of reddish-brown tiles and oak columns framing the porch. It might once have been beautiful, she thought, but not now. Curtains were drawn tightly across every window, as if the house had closed its eyes and refused to look out at the world. The front lawn had grown knee-high, weeds tangled among withered flowers. The climbing roses along the fence had dried and died, their brittle branches reaching outward like skeletal fingers. The house still stood solid and grand, yet it carried the air of a place long abandoned, even though someone still lived inside. Miriam stopped the car at the steps, but she didn't turn off the engine. Harper understood, opened the door, and stepped out. She turned to look at Miriam one last time through the window. "You'll be all right," Miriam said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Just remember, don't ask too many questions." Harper nodded without speaking. She stood there watching Miriam's car turn around and drive away, red dust swirling before slowly settling back to the earth. When the sound of the engine faded and vanished completely, silence descended like an invisible wall. Harper stood alone before the unfamiliar house, her hand gripping the worn handle of her old suitcase. The wind moved through the air, cold and dry, carrying the scent of withered grass and rotting wood. She looked up at the dark windows and wondered if someone was watching her from inside. 3 months, she told herself silently. She would cook, clean, and then leave. No attachments, no exceptions. She had sworn that to herself, and she would keep that vow at any cost, because Harper Calloway had learned the most expensive lesson of her life. To love someone meant losing them, and she had nothing left to lose. Harper drew in a long, steady breath and stepped onto the wooden porch, each footfall creaking beneath the weight of the silence that blanketed the place. She lifted her hand and knocked. The sound echoed briefly, then was swallowed whole by the stillness. No answer came. She waited a moment, then knocked again, harder this time. Still, nothing stirred inside. Harper was about to turn away and look for another way in when the door suddenly opened a fraction, slowly, without a sound. And there, framed by the dimness within, stood a little girl watching her. The child was about 5 years old, her blonde hair tangled as though it hadn't been brushed in days. Her flowered dress wrinkled and stained along the hem, but what made Harper freeze wasn't the child's appearance. It was her eyes. Large round eyes the color of the sea, clear as an autumn lake, staring without blinking. The little girl didn't speak, didn't smile, didn't cry. She simply stood there like a small porcelain statue. Harper's heart tightened, as though an invisible hand had closed around it. This child was the same age Ellie had been when she passed away. The same golden hair, the same wide eyes, the same way of standing in a doorway as if waiting for someone. Ellie had stood like that too, waiting for her to come home from work each afternoon, until the day she no longer had the strength to stand at all. Harper swallowed against the ache rising in her throat, forcing the memory back into the darkest corner of her mind. Not now. Not here. A voice came from behind the little girl, cool and older than it should have been. "You're the new housekeeper, aren't you? Come in. My father isn't home." Harper looked up. A boy of about 14 stood at the top of the staircase, tall and lean, his face angular, his gray eyes cold as steel. He wore a black t-shirt and jeans, his arms folded across his chest, studying her with indifference, as if she were nothing more than a new piece of furniture being delivered. This must be Connor, the son Miriam had mentioned. Harper stepped inside, and the smell of dampness struck her at once. It was the scent of rooms kept closed too long, of dust gathering thick in forgotten corners, of air that hadn't moved in weeks. Her eyes took a few seconds to adjust to the darkness. Every curtain was drawn tight, allowing only thin slivers of light to slip through. The house was vast and beautiful, just as it had appeared from the outside, with high ceilings, a sweeping oak staircase, and paintings hung along the walls. Yet everything lay beneath a faint gray film of dust, as though time itself had stopped here long ago. As Harper crossed the living room, she noticed something strange. Every family photograph had been turned face down against the wall, as if someone couldn't bear to look at the faces captured within. Only one photograph remained upright, placed on the mantel. In it was a blonde woman with a warm smile, her blue eyes identical to those of the little girl trailing behind Harper like a shadow. That must have been Catherine, the wife who had died. Harper stepped into the kitchen and had to steady herself to keep from sighing aloud. Dirty dishes were stacked high in the sink, nearly spilling over. Leftover food had formed a crust in pots abandoned on the stove. She opened the refrigerator and immediately had to turn her face away from the stench. The food inside had spoiled long ago. Vegetables shriveled, meat discolored. No one had cared for this kitchen in weeks, perhaps months. Throughout her quiet tour of the house, the little girl followed a few steps behind, silent and watchful. Each time Harper turned around, those large blue eyes were fixed on her, searching for something she couldn't quite understand. The child didn't demand, didn't question. She was simply there, patient and wordless, like a small shadow. Connor appeared at the end of the hallway, still wearing that same guarded expression. "Your room's in the back," he said, pointing toward the rear of the house. "There's a private bathroom, food's in the kitchen, if there's anything left worth eating." Then he turned and headed up the stairs without looking back. Harper wanted to call after him, wanted to ask something, but she didn't know what to ask. She watched the thin shoulders of the 14-year-old boy trying to carry the weight of a shattered family, and her chest ached again. She found her room at the end of the hallway. It was small and simple, with a narrow bed, an old wardrobe, and a window facing the backyard. At least there's light here, she thought as she pulled the curtains open. The backyard was as neglected as the front, weeds and thick brush growing wild, yet in the distance a small lake shimmered beneath the late afternoon sun. Harper set her worn suitcase down on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed. The springs creaked beneath her weight. She looked around the bare room and listened to the silence filling the house. No music, no laughter, no conversation. Only the wind slipping through unseen cracks and the faint ticking of a clock somewhere down the hall. This house isn't just neglected, Harper thought, her gaze settling on a thin crack in the ceiling. It's grieving. It's crying in its own way, through layers of dust, through photographs turned to the wall, through a silence heavy as lead. And those two children are trying to survive inside that grief. Alone. Harper woke before dawn, the clock on the wall pointing to 5 o'clock. She hadn't slept much through the night. The unfamiliar sounds of the old house had crept into her dreams, and whenever she managed to drift off, she saw Ellie standing in a doorway, watching her with those wide blue eyes. But that wasn't Ellie, she reminded herself as she sat up. That was Rosie. She smoothed the blanket neatly, changed her clothes, and stepped out of the room into the thick, pre-dawn darkness. The kitchen was exactly as it had been the day before, a battlefield of neglect and grief. Harper stood there for a long moment, taking in the pile of dirty dishes, the grease hardened across the stove, the cobwebs stretching across the corners of the window. Then she rolled up her sleeves and began to work. She washed each plate, scrubbed each pot, wiped every corner of the kitchen with an energy she'd thought had drained out of her long ago. Perhaps this was how she survived. Keep her hands busy so her mind wouldn't wander into places she didn't want to go. When the kitchen was finally clean, she went to each window and pulled the curtains back. The first light of dawn was just breaking along the horizon, and as she opened every window on the first floor, thin streams of sunlight poured into the house like water flowing into a desert starved for rain. Dust drifted in the air, sparkling like millions of tiny flecks of gold. She opened the refrigerator, threw out everything that had spoiled, and found in the very back a few usable eggs, an unopened package of bacon, and a box of pancake mix. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She began to cook. The eggs hissed softly in the pan. The scent of bacon spread through the kitchen and slowly into the rest of the house. She made pancakes too, stacking them neatly on a plate and drizzling a little honey she'd found in the cupboard. For the first time in months, the kitchen smelled like life. The sound of footsteps on the stairs made her look up. Connor stood on the last step, his eyes wide as he stared at the kitchen as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. He looked at the open windows, at the sunlight spilling in, at the cleared and properly set table. Then he looked at the food on the stove, and Harper saw something flicker across his face, something that looked very much like pain. "No one's cooked breakfast here in a long time," Connor said, his voice rough. "I can't remember the last time." Harper didn't answer. She simply plated the food and set it in front of him. He sat down, hesitated for a second, then began to eat. Soft footsteps followed, light as a cat's, and Rosie appeared in the doorway, still in her wrinkled pajamas. Her blonde hair tangled around her small face. She stood at the entrance to the kitchen, staring as if she were witnessing something miraculous. Harper pulled out a chair and patted the seat gently. Rosie walked over slowly, climbed up, and sat as still as a doll. Harper placed a plate in front of her, cut the pancake into small pieces, and nudged it closer. Rosie looked at the plate, then at Harper, then back at the plate. Then, she picked up her fork and began to eat. Connor paused midway through his meal and stared at his sister in astonishment. "This is the first time in months she's finished a whole serving," he whispered to Harper, as though afraid speaking too loudly might shatter the moment. "Usually we have to beg her just to take a few bites." The three of them ate in silence, but it was a different kind of silence from the lifeless stillness that had filled the house before. This was a peaceful quiet, the kind that belongs to an autumn morning when the world is slowly waking up. Sunlight slanted through the windows, painting golden squares across the wooden floor, and for the first time, Harper thought that perhaps 3 months here wouldn't be so bad. The sound of a car engine in the driveway broke that fragile peace. Harper glanced out the window and saw a sleek black SUV pull up in front of the house. The door opened, and a man stepped out. The air in the room seemed to thicken at once. She felt it immediately. The shift in Connor's posture, the way his body stiffened, the way Rosie stopped eating and lowered her eyes to her plate. The front door opened, and Killian Ashford walked in. He was tall enough to nearly fill the doorway, broad-shouldered, solid as a wall. He wore a black suit and a black shirt open at the collar, revealing a hint of his chest and a thin silver chain resting against his skin. But what held Harper's gaze was his face, angular and severe, with a sharp jawline and eyes the color of winter steel. A faint scar ran from the corner of his left eye down toward his jaw, a mark of a past he likely didn't care to discuss. He stood there for a second, his gaze sweeping over the kitchen, over the open windows, over the sunlight flooding in, over his 2 children sitting at the table. Then his eyes settled on Harper. "You're the new one," he said, his voice low and cold. Not a question, but a statement. Harper nodded, her throat suddenly dry. "Yes, I'm Harper Calloway." He didn't respond. He didn't introduce himself, didn't offer a greeting, didn't ask a single question. He looked at her for one more unreadable second, then turned away. He walked past the table as though it didn't exist, past his children as though they were invisible ghosts. He headed straight up the stairs, his heavy footsteps echoing in the quiet, and disappeared around the bend. Harper watched his retreating figure, and suddenly she understood. Killian Ashford wasn't a cold man. He was a man running from the kitchen where his wife had once cooked, from the table where his family had once sat together, from the eyes of a daughter who looked exactly like the woman he had lost. He was running from everything that reminded him of what had been taken from him. She knew that because she recognized those eyes. The eyes of someone who had lost everything and was bone deep, afraid of losing anything more. She knew those eyes as well as she knew her own reflection, because every morning when she looked into the mirror, she saw that same pair of eyes staring back at her. A week passed like water moving slowly through a narrow crevice in stone. Harper settled into a rhythm as steady as the ticking of a clock. She rose at 5 o'clock each morning, while the sky was still gray, prepared breakfast before the children woke, cleaned each room with patient care, and opened every window so light and fresh air could pour into a house that had been suffocating for far too long. She worked without pause, not for the wages, but because busy hands left the mind no time to wander into the darker corridors of memory. The house began to change little by little, like a living creature slowly awakening from a long winter sleep. The dust that coated every surface thinned and then disappeared. Cobwebs in the corners were swept away. The wooden floors were polished until they reflected the glow of the late afternoon sun. The stale odor of damp neglect gave way to the scent of hot meals, clean floor polish, and the soft fragrance of lavender that Harper placed in small vases throughout the rooms. The kitchen became the heart of the house, a place where warmth lingered, where something fragrant was always rising from the stove, where gentle golden light glowed each evening. Killian remained like a ghost, drifting through the life of his own family. He was rarely home, and when he was, he went straight to the study at the end of the upstairs hallway, the door always locked from the inside. Sometimes Harper heard the low murmur of his voice through the wood as he spoke on the telephone, his tone cold and controlled, using words she didn't understand about matters she didn't want to know. He never joined the children for dinner after that first morning, never asked how their lessons were going, never wished them good night. He existed in the house like a paying lodger, with no intention of truly staying. Harper first discovered the truth of that on a night when she woke to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. It was nearly midnight, and she heard the front door open and close very softly. Curiosity overcame caution. She went to the window and looked out. In the faint wash of moonlight, she saw Killian's tall figure crossing the yard toward a small cabin about 50 meters from the main house. He opened the cabin door, stepped inside, and a light flicked on. She stood there watching until the light went out, realizing that was where he slept each night, not in the large house, not in the bedroom he had once shared with his wife, but alone in a small cabin set apart in the open field. He couldn't bear to sleep within walls that still carried the echo of Catherine's breath. After that night, Harper began to notice more. Each evening, Connor would sit on the back porch after dinner, gazing toward the cabin where his father stayed. He would sit there for hours, sometimes until late, watching the faint glow of the cabin light until it finally went dark. He never walked over, never knocked, never called out to his father. He only sat and watched, as though guarding something precious he didn't dare to touch. Rosie, meanwhile, began following Harper like a small shadow. Wherever Harper went, the little girl appeared quietly behind her, saying nothing, asking nothing, simply there. When Harper cooked, Rosie sat in the corner of the kitchen and watched. When Harper cleaned, Rosie trailed from room to room. When Harper stepped into the garden to gather vegetables, Rosie stood beside her, those wide blue eyes tracking every movement. The child still didn't speak, but her silent presence spoke more than words ever could. Rosie was searching for something she had lost, and for reasons Harper couldn't quite explain, the child seemed to believe she might find it in her. That thought warmed Harper's heart and frightened her at the same time. Then came the night that changed everything. Around 2 a.m, Harper was jolted awake by the sound of engines in the yard. Not one vehicle, but several. She lay still for a moment, listening, then curiosity again outweighed caution. She slipped quietly from bed, went to the window, and eased the curtain aside. Her heart skipped. 3 black SUVs were parked in a row outside. Men dressed in dark clothing moved large crates from the vehicles into a warehouse behind the house. They worked in silence, swift and efficient, as though they had done this 100 times before, and at the center of it all stood Killian, issuing orders with short, decisive gestures. He didn't resemble the man Harper saw inside the house, the one who moved past the dinner table with hollow eyes. This Killian was someone else entirely, cold, dangerous, radiating authority without needing to raise his voice. The men around him lowered their heads as he passed, carrying out his instructions without question. Moonlight fell across his face, illuminating the scar and the ice in his eyes. He looked like a king of shadows, a ruler over things ordinary people wouldn't dare to imagine. Harper stepped back from the window, her heart pounding hard against her ribs. She knew she had just seen something she wasn't meant to see. She wasn't foolish. She understood that what was happening outside wasn't ordinary business. The black-clad guards, the towering security gates, the expensive vehicles, and now these mysterious crates arriving in the middle of the night. Killian Ashford wasn't merely a wealthy businessman. He was something far more dangerous, something Miriam had warned her never to question. Harper returned to bed and lay staring at the ceiling in the dark. "It isn't my concern," she told herself. "I'm here to cook, not to ask questions. 3 months, and then I'll leave. Whatever Killian Ashford does in the night has nothing to do with me." But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't sleep. She lay there until the first light of dawn slipped through the curtains, her mind circling questions she knew she shouldn't try to answer. And deep within her, a small, quiet voice whispered that she had stepped into a world where walking away wouldn't be as simple as she had once believed. That afternoon, Harper decided to make cookies. She took out her mother's old recipe notebook and set it on the kitchen table, carefully turning to a page yellowed with age and stained with grease from years of use. It was one of the few things she had managed to keep from her former life. A small book filled with her mother's slanted handwriting, each recipe a fragment of memory from long-ago afternoons in a modest childhood kitchen. She began measuring the ingredients: flour, sugar, butter, eggs, and as always, Rosie appeared at the kitchen doorway like a small shadow. The little girl stood there quietly, her wide blue eyes following Harper's every movement, not asking for anything, not speaking, simply watching. Harper had grown accustomed to that silent presence, and in a strange way, she found comfort in having Rosie nearby. She had a habit of talking to herself while cooking, a habit formed in the days when Ellie would sit on a high stool and listen to her mother chatter about everything and nothing. "My mother taught me to make these cookies when I was very little," Harper said softly, her voice gentle as if telling a bedtime story. "She used to say the secret isn't in the ingredients. The secret is in the love you put in while you mix the dough." Harper gave a quiet laugh as she remembered her mother standing in their small kitchen, apron dusted with flour, hair pinned up high. She always sang while she cooked, old songs Harper could no longer recall the words to, though the melodies still lingered somewhere deep inside her. She was stirring the dough, lost in memory, when a tiny voice broke the silence. "My mom used to make cookies too." Harper froze. The wooden spoon stopped midair, her heart missing a beat. She turned slowly to Rosie, hardly trusting what she had heard. The child stood there, blue eyes fixed on her, lips parted slightly as though she herself was surprised by the sound of her own voice. It was the first time Rosie had spoken since Harper arrived. The first time in many months, if Connor was to be believed. Harper lowered the spoon carefully, trying to steady her breathing. She knelt down, slow and gentle, until her eyes were level with Rosie's. She didn't want to do anything that might frighten the child back into her shell of silence. "What kind of cookies did your mom make, sweetheart?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her effort to remain calm. Rosie studied her for a moment, those deep blue eyes holding a sorrow far too heavy for someone so young. "Chocolate chip," she said, her voice as soft as falling leaves, "but I can't remember how they smelled anymore." Harper's heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. Ellie had said something very similar a few months before she slipped away. "I can't remember how Grandma's perfume smells, Mommy." Ellie had cried when she said it, afraid she was forgetting someone she loved. Harper had held her close and promised she would buy that exact perfume so her daughter would never forget, but she hadn't been fast enough. Hospitals, chemotherapy, endless days and nights, and then Ellie was gone before Harper could keep her promise. Harper blinked hard, forcing the tears back. "Not now. Not in front of this child. Then we'll make a new smell to remember," she said, her voice thick but carrying a small smile. She stood and lifted Rosie gently onto the tall stool beside the counter. For the first time, Rosie didn't stiffen at Harper's touch. The little girl sat there as Harper added chocolate chips to the dough and handed her a small wooden spoon. "Would you like to help?" Rosie looked at the spoon, then at Harper, then slowly reached out and took it. She began stirring, awkward and careful, but her eyes brightened just a little, like a candle newly lit in a dark room. Harper guided her step by step, how to measure the flour, how to crack the eggs, how to roll the dough into small round balls. At one point, a bit of flour dusted Rosie's nose. The child touched it, looked at her powdered finger, then up at Harper. And then something miraculous happened. Rosie smiled. It was only a small smile, fleeting as a butterfly brushing the surface of water, but it was the first smile Harper had seen on her face. Harper's heart tightened, aching and warm all at once, a feeling she had thought she'd forgotten. Neither of them noticed Connor standing in the doorway. The 14-year-old leaned quietly against the frame, watching his sister smile for the first time in months. His face remained guarded as always, but something in his eyes softened, like ice beginning to thaw beneath the first light of spring. He didn't step inside. He didn't speak, but he didn't walk away either. He stayed there until the last batch of cookies came out of the oven, until the sweet scent of chocolate and butter filled the kitchen, creating a new fragrance to remember. That night, after the house had fallen asleep, Harper lay in bed and cried. She cried without a sound, tears slipping down her cheeks and soaking into the pillow. She cried for Rosie, a child who had lost her mother too soon and was trying to hold on to fading sense. She cried for Ellie, her own little angel who had flown away without a chance to say goodbye. She cried for every child in the world who had lost a mother, and for every mother who had lost a child. She cried for the unfairness of fate, for grief that never truly disappears, for wounds that seem healed yet bleed again at the slightest touch. And she cried for something else, too. Something she was afraid to name. She was beginning to care about these children. She was beginning to let her heart soften, and that went against every vow she had made to herself. The storm swept into Montana in the middle of the night, without warning. The sky, calm only moments before, suddenly roared like a wild beast, shaken from sleep. Black clouds rolled in and swallowed the moon, and then the rain came down as if someone were pouring an entire ocean from the heavens. Thunder crashed again and again. Lightning tore the darkness into blinding shards of white, and the wind howled through the cracks in the house like a pack of wolves in the distance. Then the power went out. The house fell into complete darkness, lit only by sudden flashes of lightning that made the windows tremble in their frames. Harper lay awake in bed, eyes open, staring at the ceiling, when Rosie's scream split the night apart. It was the terrified cry of a 5-year-old child frightened to the marrow of her bones. Harper was on her feet instantly, her bare soles striking the cold wooden floor as her hand reached for the flashlight she kept beside her bed. She hurried into the hallway, the beam cutting through the dark as she made her way to Rosie's room at the end. She pushed the door open. In the thin circle of light, she saw Rosie curled on the bed, hands clamped over her ears, eyes squeezed shut, sobbing without breath. The small body shook violently, like a leaf caught in a gale. Harper didn't think. She moved on instinct. She crossed the room in 2 strides, sat on the bed, and gathered Rosie into her arms. The child stiffened for a second at the touch, then clung to Harper as if she were a life preserver in a raging sea. Tiny fingers fisted into her shirt, the little face buried against her chest, sobs breaking into desperate hiccups. "Hush now. It's all right," Harper whispered, stroking Rosie's back. "It's only a storm. I'm here. I'm right here with you." But Rosie kept trembling, kept crying, and Harper knew this wasn't only the storm outside. It was the storm inside the child. The fear of being left alone. The memory of nights when her mother had held her through thunder. A mother who wasn't there anymore. Without pausing to consider, Harper began to sing. An old lullaby, soft and tinged with sadness. The same one her own mother had sung to her. The same one she had once sung to Ellie. Ellie had been afraid of storms too. Harper used to wrap her daughter in blankets and sing this very song over and over until those small brown eyes drifted closed in peaceful sleep. The last time she had sung it was the night before Ellie went into the hospital for the final time. The last night she had held her child in her arms. Harper sang now, her voice hoarse and trembling, but she didn't stop. She sang for Rosie, and she sang for Ellie, for the daughter who had slipped beyond her reach, yet never beyond her memory. Slowly, Rosie's sobs softened. The trembling eased. Her breathing grew steadier. She nestled against Harper, her head resting over Harper's heart, blue eyes growing heavy. One small hand remained clutching Harper's shirt, as if afraid that letting go would make her disappear. Harper didn't realize Connor was standing in the doorway until lightning flashed and illuminated his figure. The 14-year-old leaned against the frame in wrinkled pajamas. He didn't speak. He didn't step inside. But he didn't leave either. He stood there watching his sister held safely in Harper's arms, and on his usually guarded face, Harper glimpsed something gentler, something like a longing to be sheltered himself, a longing he hid behind a mask of forced maturity. It was the first time Connor had stood near anyone during a storm since his mother died. Then Harper sensed another presence. She lifted her head and, in the faint glow of the flashlight, saw Killian standing in the hallway just behind Connor. He didn't enter the room. He simply stood there in the shadows, looking in. Lightning flashed again, and for a brief second his face was fully revealed. Pain, longing, and a fear so deep it seemed carved into his bones. He was watching his daughter held in another woman's arms, hearing her soothed by a voice that wasn't Catherine's, and he couldn't step forward. Not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't dare. Killian said nothing. He didn't come in. He didn't walk away. He remained there, silent as stone, standing guard from a distance in the heart of the night. The storm raged outside, yet inside that small room 4 souls were searching for peace in their own fragile ways. Harper held Rosie until the child fell asleep, until the thunder softened, until the first pale light of dawn slipped through the curtains. When she finally glanced toward the hallway, Killian was gone. The next morning, as Harper prepared breakfast, Rosie ran into the kitchen with eyes brighter than usual. "Daddy stood outside my door all night," she said in a small voice that carried something close to pride. "I saw him when I woke up before the sun came up. He was still there." Harper paused, looking at the child, then out the window toward the small cabin resting quietly beneath the early light. And she understood. Killian wasn't a father who abandoned his children. He was a father who loved them so fiercely, it frightened him. He was afraid to look into Rosie's blue eyes because they mirrored Catherine's. Afraid to hold his daughter, because it would remind him of holding his wife. Afraid to love anyone again because he had already lost Catherine. He had stood outside that door all night, not because he didn't care, but because he cared too much to risk stepping inside. After the night of the storm, something in the house shifted. It wasn't a grand transformation, only small fractures forming in the wall of ice that had long surrounded this family. Harper sensed it in the way Rosie began to speak a little more, in the way Connor sometimes paused at the kitchen doorway instead of heading straight upstairs, in the way Killian was no longer entirely invisible, even though he still kept his distance. And so she decided to do something deliberate, something intentional, a real dinner, a family dinner the way a family was meant to have. Harper spent the entire afternoon in the kitchen. She took out her mother's recipe notebook and turned to the page for roasted chicken with potatoes, a dish her mother used to make on special occasions. She rubbed the chicken with herbs and butter, arranged the potatoes around it, slid the pan into the oven, and let the scent slowly fill the house. She prepared a salad, baked fresh bread, and made the sauce exactly the way her mother had taught her. When everything was ready, she began to set the table. She found a white tablecloth tucked in a drawer, still pristine as if it had never been used, and spread it across the large oak dining table. She placed white porcelain plates trimmed in gold that she had discovered in the cabinet, polished crystal glasses, and silverware she had carefully cleaned until it shone. She lit 2 white candles in the center, their flames flickering softly and casting a warmth the house had been missing for far too long. It was the first time in more than a year that the dining table had been properly set. Harper called Connor and Rosie down for dinner. Rosie came running almost at once, blue eyes lighting up at the sight of the beautifully arranged table. Connor appeared a few minutes later, stopping at the foot of the stairs as he took in the room, surprise plain on his face. He didn't say anything, but he took his seat without being asked twice. Harper brought out the food, placed the dishes on the table, and sat down. She didn't expect Killian to come. He hadn't joined them for dinner since she arrived, always locking himself in his study or disappearing somewhere beyond the house. But just as she was about to tell the children to begin, the sound of a door opening echoed from upstairs. The door to Killian's study. Harper looked up, and her heart skipped when she saw him standing at the top of the staircase. He looked down at the dining room, at the carefully set table, at the candlelight flickering, at his 2 children waiting. He hesitated, standing there as though locked in battle with himself. Behind him, Harper caught a glimpse of Hudson, Killian's right hand, murmuring something she couldn't quite hear. She saw Hudson give a small nod toward the stairs, as if urging him forward, and then Killian descended, 1 step at a time, slowly, as though each stair cost him something. He reached the table, pulled out a chair, and sat down. He didn't look at anyone. His eyes remained lowered to the plate before him, but he was there. For the first time in more than a year, Killian Ashford sat down to dinner with his children. The meal began in silence. The only sounds were the soft clink of silverware against porcelain, the quiet rhythm of chewing, the setting down of glasses. The air felt tight enough for Harper to sense it against her skin. She didn't know what to say, and clearly no one else did either. Then Rosie spoke. "Harper let me lick the spoon when we made cookies," she said, her clear voice breaking the silence. "I got flour on my nose. It was fun." Harper looked at Rosie, then at Killian. He was watching his daughter, and she saw something shift in his eyes. It was the first time he had heard Rosie's voice in months, the first time he had seen his daughter speak like a normal child, instead of lingering in silence like a ghost. His cold gray eyes shimmered in the candlelight, and Harper glimpsed a thread of warmth struggling through the ice. Connor suddenly spoke, his tone still guarded but no longer sharp. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" he asked Harper. It was a simple question, yet it was the first time he had initiated conversation beyond curt replies. Harper smiled faintly. "My mother taught me," she said. She kept a recipe notebook, wrote everything by hand, from simple meals to complicated ones. She used to say every recipe is a story, and when you cook, you're telling that story again. "Is she still alive?" Connor asked. "No," Harper shook her head. "She passed away when I was 16. But I still have the notebook. It's the most precious thing I own." There was a pause, then Connor nodded, as though he understood something that didn't need to be spoken aloud. He returned to his meal, and Harper realized this was the longest conversation she had ever had with him. The dinner continued with few words, yet the silence no longer felt so heavy. Rosie spoke more about helping with the cookies. Connor asked a few quiet questions about Harper's childhood in Montana, and Killian listened. He didn't speak, but he remained, and he listened. When the meal was over, Connor took Rosie upstairs, leaving Harper to clear the table. She was stacking plates by the sink when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned and found Killian standing in the kitchen doorway. He studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable, yet something in his eyes had changed. "The food was good," he said. Just 2 words, his voice low and rough. Then he turned and walked out of the kitchen, out of the house, toward the cabin, as he did every night. But Harper stood at the kitchen window watching him, and she saw him pause halfway across the yard. He stood there for a moment, glancing back at the house, at the lit windows, at the place where minutes earlier he had sat at the table with his children. Only then did he continue on. 2 words, Harper thought as his figure disappeared into the cabin. Only 2 words, but it was more than Killian had said to anyone in that house since Catherine died, and somehow that meant more than 1,000. A sleek black Mercedes pulled up in front of the house on a Saturday morning, while Harper was tidying the living room and the children were eating breakfast in the kitchen. She had never seen the car before, and instinct told her this wasn't a friendly visit. The driver's door opened, and a woman stepped out. She was tall and slender, dressed in an expensive navy dress that Harper suspected cost more than her monthly salary. Her blonde hair was swept neatly into a low chignon, diamonds glinting at her ears and throat, and her blue eyes were sharp and cold as steel. The eyes were identical to Catherine's in the photograph above the fireplace, but without warmth, without kindness, only judgment. The woman climbed the porch steps, her heels striking the wood with deliberate clicks, and stopped when she saw Harper at the door. She looked Harper up and down, her gaze scanning her as though evaluating a worn item in an antique shop. "You must be the help," she said, not as a question but as a statement edged with disdain. "I'm Victoria Reed, Connor and Rosie's aunt." Before Harper could respond, Victoria brushed past her and entered the house without invitation, as if it belonged to her. Harper stood there for a second, anger rising in her chest, but she swallowed it and followed. Victoria moved from room to room like an inspector surveying a scene. She ran a finger along tabletops to check for dust, peered into the kitchen, glanced around the living room, observing everything with critical eyes. When she noticed how clean and orderly the house was, surprise flickered briefly across her face before it vanished. Connor and Rosie were in the kitchen when Victoria entered. Connor's expression hardened instantly, guarded and cold, while Rosie shrank back, slipping from her chair and running to hide behind Harper. The little girl's hand clutched Harper's shirt tightly, seeking protection. Victoria took a seat across from Connor and began firing questions. "How are your grades? Are you eating properly? Is your father home often?" Connor answered curtly, each word clipped and spare. "Fine. Yes. No." He didn't look at her. He didn't attempt politeness. Victoria turned to Rosie, attempting conversation. But Rosie pressed closer to Harper and said nothing. After several futile minutes, Victoria stood and faced Harper, her eyes icy. "I'm considering filing for custody," she said plainly. "These children deserve better than a father who can't even look them in the eye." Before Harper could reply, the front door opened. Killian stepped inside, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop at once. He halted when he saw Victoria, his face hardened into stone, his gray eyes cooling several degrees more. "Victoria," he said evenly. "Killian," she replied with equal chill. They faced one another like two wild animals measuring the distance before a strike. "My sister died from the strain of living with you," Victoria said, her voice trembling with tightly leashed anger. "The secrets, the danger. I won't let her children suffer the same fate. They're my children," Killian answered, his tone low and dangerous. "A father who sleeps in a cabin like a stable hand?" Victoria shot back with open contempt. "A father who doesn't speak to his own son for weeks at a time? The court can decide whether that qualifies as fatherhood." Killian didn't respond, but Harper saw his jaw tighten, his hands curl into fists at his sides. The tension in the air was electric, like the charge before lightning strikes. Victoria regained her composure, adjusted the strap of her handbag on her shoulder, and walked toward the door. At the threshold, she paused and looked back at Killian. "You have 2 months to prove me wrong," she said, "though I doubt you can." Then she left, her heels echoing sharply across the porch, climbed into her Mercedes, and drove away without a backward glance. Silence settled over the house once the car disappeared down the road. Killian stood motionless for a moment. Then without a word he turned, went upstairs to his study, and shut the door with finality. Harper exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She looked around and saw Connor standing at the base of the staircase, his face pale as paper. He had heard everything. Harper handed Rosie off to one of the staff and crossed to Connor. "Are you all right?" she asked gently. He looked at her, and for the first time she saw the 14-year-old as he truly was. Afraid, confused, hurt. "She wants to take us away from Dad," he said, his voice unsteady. "And maybe she's right." Harper didn't know what to say. She wanted to tell him Victoria was wrong, that Killian was a good father, that everything would be fine. But she couldn't, because part of her was asking the same question. A father who slept alone in a cabin every night. A father who couldn't look into his daughter's eyes. A father who disappeared into the shadows whenever grief pressed too hard. Was that truly what was best for these children? Harper didn't have an answer, and her silence spoke louder than anything she could have said. That night Harper couldn't sleep. Victoria's words echoed in her mind like a bell that refused to stop ringing. A father who sleeps in a stable. A father who can't look his children in the eye. The court will decide. She lay on her back staring at the ceiling, listening to the steady hum of insects beyond the window, Then the sound of engines shattered the stillness. Not one vehicle, but several. Tires grinding over gravel. Engines rumbling, then cutting off. Harper knew she shouldn't look. She remembered the last time. Remembered what she had seen. Remembered the pounding in her chest when she realized Killian Ashford wasn't an ordinary businessman. But curiosity overpowered reason. She rose from bed, moved to the window, eased the curtain aside, and looked out. This time she watched longer, more carefully. 3 large trucks were parked in the yard, and at least a dozen men dressed in black were unloading heavy crates and carrying them into the warehouse behind the house. They worked in silence, quick and efficient. At the center of it all stood Killian like a general surveying a battlefield. He was speaking with Hudson. Though Harper couldn't hear clearly, fragments drifted toward her through the night air. Santos, border, shipment. She didn't understand every detail, but she understood enough. This was what Miriam had warned her not to ask about. This was why armed guards stood watch day and night. This was the secret Killian Ashford hid behind the polished image of a successful entrepreneur. Harper stepped back from the window, her heart racing, her hands trembling. What was she supposed to do? Leave? Pretend she had seen nothing and continue as if her world hadn't tilted? A soft knock at her door made her jump. She stood frozen, breath held, unsure whether to answer. The knock came again, still gentle but firm. Harper inhaled deeply, crossed the room, and opened the door. Hudson stood there, his face shadowed by the dim hallway light. He didn't look threatening, yet there was a gravity in his eyes that sent a chill through her. "You saw things tonight," Hudson said quietly. "Things you weren't meant to see." Harper swallowed and forced her voice steady. "I didn't come here to ask questions. I came here to cook." Hudson studied her for a long moment, as if measuring the truth in her words. "Most people would run by now," he said. Harper thought of the suitcase in the corner. Thought of Rosie hiding behind her when Victoria arrived. Thought of Connor's pale face when he heard his aunt threaten to take him away from his father. And she thought of herself. Of the last 3 years lived in numb emptiness. "I've already lost everything, Mr. Mercer," she replied, her voice flat and still as a windless lake. "There's nothing left for me to be afraid of." Hudson held her gaze a moment longer, and something shifted in his expression. Not pity, not suspicion. Something closer to respect. "Killian isn't a bad man," Hudson said after a pause. "He's just trapped in the dark. Don't give up on him." Harper didn't answer. She didn't know how to. Hudson turned to leave, but paused at the doorway without looking back. "Stay away from the windows at night, for your own safety. Santos has eyes everywhere." Then he disappeared into the hallway, his footsteps fading into silence. Harper remained standing there, staring at the empty space he had occupied. Santos, the name again. She didn't know who he was or how deep the danger ran, but she understood one thing. She had stepped into a world where walking back out wouldn't be simple. Instead of returning to bed, Harper moved down the hallway toward the children's rooms. She needed to see them, needed to know they were safe, though she couldn't explain why that mattered so much to her now. She paused at Rosie's door, which stood slightly ajar, and looked inside. Rosie slept curled beneath her blanket, clutching a worn stuffed bear. Her small face was peaceful in sleep, lips parted, breathing soft and even. She looked like a tiny angel, untouched by fear or sorrow in that moment. Harper stood there watching, her heart softening in a way that startled her. She eased the door closed and moved on to Connor's room. His door was shut, but she opened it slightly and glanced inside. Connor lay on his bed facing the wall. He wasn't asleep. Harper could tell, but he didn't turn around. Perhaps he lay there thinking, worrying about what Victoria had said, about what might happen to his family. Harper closed the door quietly and stood alone in the dark hallway. She should leave. She should return to her room, pack her suitcase, and be gone before dawn. That would be the sensible choice. She was only the housekeeper. Not family, not responsible. Yet her feet didn't move toward her room. They stayed rooted where she stood, as if nailed to the floor. In the darkness of that unfamiliar house, surrounded by dangerous secrets and grieving children, Harper understood something that frightened her more than Santos or midnight shipments ever could. She didn't want to leave. The incident happened at dinner, a few days after Victoria's visit. Harper had prepared a simple meal, and as had become her habit, she set the table for the whole family even though she knew Killian rarely appeared. But that evening he came downstairs. Perhaps Victoria's words were still echoing in his mind. Perhaps he understood that something had to change before it was too late. He took his seat across from Connor, and for the first time in weeks, father and son looked at one another. The air in the room thickened as though all the oxygen had been drawn out. Rosie sat perfectly still, blue eyes darting back and forth between her father and her brother. Harper stood in the kitchen doorway, sensing the storm about to break. Killian spoke first, his voice rough from disuse. "How's school?" It was a simple question, ordinary, the kind any father might ask, but it lit the fuse of a bomb long waiting to explode. Connor lifted his head, gray eyes so like his father's now burning with anger. "Now you care?" he said, his voice trembling with restraint. "Now?" Killian opened his mouth to answer, but Connor didn't give him the chance. "Where were you when Mom was dying?" he shouted, springing to his feet so suddenly his chair crashed to the floor. "Where were you when Rosie stopped talking? Where were you every night this past year while I was the one taking care of her alone?" Killian stood frozen. He didn't argue, didn't defend himself, didn't explain, because every accusation was true. Every word struck its mark. He hadn't been there. He had run. He had let his children navigate the loss of their mother while he drowned in his own grief. "You're not a father," Connor went on, his voice breaking as tears streamed down his face. "You're just a ghost who pays the bills." And before anyone could stop him, he bolted from the room, out of the house, into the falling dusk. The door slammed. His footsteps faded toward the woods behind the ranch. Rosie began to cry. Harper rushed to gather her in her arms, but her eyes searched for Killian. He was still standing there, pale as if someone had driven a blade straight through his heart. Then he ran. He ran out the door in the direction Connor had disappeared. Hudson appeared from somewhere, along with several guards, and they scattered into the dark to search. But the forest and the coming night swallowed the 14-year-old boy, as though he had never been there at all. An hour passed, then 2. Clouds rolled in and rain began to fall, light at first, then heavier. Harper paced the living room. Rosie had been taken upstairs, though Harper knew the child wasn't sleeping. She thought of Connor out there alone in the rain, in the darkness, carrying all that anger and hurt. Then she remembered something. In a rare moment of openness, Connor had once told her about the lake behind the property. "Mom used to take me there," he had said. She said it was the quietest place in the world. Harper didn't hesitate. She ran outside into the rain to find Killian. She found him near the edge of the woods, his face drawn, his clothes soaked through. "I know where he is," she shouted over the downpour. Killian turned to her, gray eyes desperate. "How?" "Because I listen," she answered. They ran through the forest, branches whipping at their faces, mud slick beneath their feet. Rain poured down as if the sky itself had broken open, but neither of them slowed. And then they saw him. Connor sat at the edge of the lake, knees drawn up, shoulders shaking from sobs or from cold or both. He looked small there in the rain, no longer the boy who tried so hard to be grown, only a 14-year-old child in pain. Killian stopped a few steps away. He didn't speak. No apologies, no explanations, no promises. He simply walked forward and sat beside his son, letting the rain drench them both, letting silence speak what words couldn't. Harper remained at a distance beneath the trees, watching father and son sit together by the water. She saw Connor's shoulders continue to tremble, saw Killian sit rigid as stone. Then slowly, very slowly, Connor leaned his head against his father's shoulder. For the first time in more than a year, Killian didn't move, as if afraid the smallest motion might shatter the fragile moment. Then he lifted his hand and rested it on his son's back, leaving it there. They sat like that, two figures in the rain by the lake where Catherine had once brought her child. No words. None were needed. Sometimes silence is the only language capable of healing. Harper turned away, giving them the space they deserved. She walked back toward the house, rain streaming down her face. Yet she didn't feel cold. Her eyes were wet, but not because of the storm. It was late when the house finally settled into silence. Connor had been brought back, given a hot shower and dry clothes, and had fallen asleep from exhaustion after the storm of emotion. Rosie had been asleep for hours, curled around her worn teddy bear, unaware of what had unfolded. Harper sat alone in the kitchen, brewing a pot of tea to warm the chill that still clung to her bones from the rain. Her hair remained damp. She had changed her clothes, yet the cold seemed to have seeped deeper than fabric. She cradled the hot cup in both hands and stared out the window where darkness lay heavy over the garden. Soft footsteps sounded in the hallway, and Harper looked up. Killian stood in the kitchen doorway, his hair still wet, a fresh black shirt clinging to his broad shoulders, though he looked utterly spent. He lingered there a moment, as if debating whether to enter. Then he stepped inside, pulled out a chair, and sat across from her. It was the first time they had sat like this, not as employer and housekeeper, but as equals, two wounded souls carrying scars the world never saw. Harper said nothing. She rose quietly, retrieved another cup, poured tea, and set it before him. Killian looked at the cup, then at her. "How did you know where he was?" he asked, his voice rough. Harper settled back into her chair, hands wrapped around her own cup. "Connor told me about the lake," she said softly, "about how his mother used to take him there to watch the sunset. He said it was the quietest place he knew." Silence settled between them. Killian stared into the tea as it slowly cooled, turning the cup absently in his hands. Then he spoke, so quietly she almost missed it. "Do you have family, Harper?" The question was simple, yet it unlocked a door she had kept sealed for 3 years. She lowered her gaze to the reflection of the kitchen light in her cup and began. "I had a daughter," she said, her voice trembling faintly. "Ellie. She was 4 when she passed. Curly brown hair, always smiling. She loved to draw butterflies. She could sit for hours filling pages with wings in every color she could imagine." Harper drew a slow breath to steady herself. "Leukemia came out of nowhere. One day she was running in the yard, the next she was in a hospital bed with tubes everywhere. 8 months of fighting, 8 months of hope and heartbreak, and then one night she fell asleep and didn't wake up." Killian didn't interrupt. His gray eyes remained fixed on her, unblinking. "My husband, Jonathan, couldn't survive it," she continued. "He blamed me, said I hadn't cared for her well enough, that I should have caught it sooner. Then he turned to alcohol. 1 drink each evening became a bottle. Then more." She paused, swallowing. "The first time he hit me was on Ellie's first death anniversary. I was crying in front of her photograph, and he told me I had no right to cry because I was the one who killed her. Then he struck me." Killian's jaw tightened, a muscle flickering near his temple, but he remained silent. "He died in a drunk driving accident," Harper said, her tone almost detached. "I got the news while I was in the hospital from the bruises he'd left the night before. His family threw me out. They said I'd destroyed their son, their granddaughter. They took everything. The house, the money, even Ellie's photographs. I left with 1 suitcase and my mother's recipe book. That was all." The kitchen fell into deep quiet. Only the clock ticked against the wall, and the wind brushed the window. Harper kept her eyes lowered, afraid she might see pity in his face, something she despised. But when she finally looked up, she found no pity there, only recognition. "Catherine was sick for 2 years, Killian said at last, his voice low and strained. "I convinced myself I was protecting her by carrying everything alone. The business, the dangers, the threats. I thought I was shielding her, but the truth is, I was never there." He stared into the distance, beyond the walls. "She died while I was in an important meeting. By the time I reached the hospital, she was gone. She died holding a nurse's hand, not mine." They looked at one another across the kitchen table, across cups of tea gone cold, across confessions laid bare. They didn't need more words. They understood each other in the way only those who have walked through fire can understand. "You've done what I couldn't," Killian said after a long silence. "You made the children trust again." Harper's eyes shimmered, though she didn't cry. "Maybe because I'm not trying to be their mother," she replied gently. "I'm just here, that's all." Killian nodded slowly, and in that quiet exchange, something shifted between them. Not love, not yet, but connection, recognition, the fragile realization that neither of them was entirely alone in their grief anymore. Harper spent the entire week preparing for Rosie's birthday. She planned every small detail, from decorating the living room to choosing the perfect cake recipe. It would be the little girl's first birthday since her mother passed, and Harper knew it had to be special. Not to replace the birthdays that came before, but to create a new memory, a new scent to remember. She baked chocolate chip cake using the recipe she and Rosie had created together that afternoon in the kitchen. The aroma of chocolate and butter drifted through the house from early morning, and for the first time, the house smelled like a birthday celebration. Connor, though he maintained his guarded expression, woke early to blow up balloons. He didn't say much, but he was there, sitting in the corner of the living room with a pile of brightly colored balloons, inflating them one by one with a patience Harper hadn't known he possessed. And what surprised her most was Killian. He didn't disappear into his study as usual. He stayed home all day, awkward and uncertain, trying to help in his own way. Harper caught sight of him standing in the corner of the living room, attempting to tie a ribbon onto a cluster of balloons, hands accustomed to holding weapons and signing contracts now fumbling with a strip of pink satin. The sight was both faintly amusing and deeply moving. The party took place in the afternoon. Rosie wore a white dress Harper had carefully washed and pressed, her golden hair brushed smooth and tied with a pink bow. She looked like a small angel, blue eyes shining when she saw the decorated room. When Harper carried in the cake with 6 candles glowing, the family sang happy birthday. Connor's voice was low and slightly embarrassed. Killian's was rough, unused to singing, but they sang. For the first time in more than a year, music filled the house. Rosie closed her eyes, made her wish, blew out the candles, and opened them again with the brightest smile Harper had ever seen on her face. When it was time for presents, Rosie received a large box from Killian. She tore at the wrapping paper with the eager excitement of a 6-year-old. When she saw what lay inside, she fell silent. It was a doll with shining blonde hair and bright blue eyes, dressed in a pristine white gown. "The doll looks like Mommy," Rosie whispered, hugging it to her chest. Killian went still. Harper saw his entire body freeze for a heartbeat, as though his daughter's words had pierced the armor he had built around himself. Then slowly, very slowly, he knelt in front of her, bringing himself to her eye level. His eyes were wet, and he didn't attempt to hide the tears. "Happy birthday, my little girl," he said, his voice thick. "Your mother would be so proud of you." Rosie reached up and touched his cheek where a tear slid down. Then she wrapped her arms around his neck, the doll pressed between them, and Killian embraced his daughter, truly embraced her. For the first time since Catherine died, Harper stood nearby, smiling at the sight. Yet her hand gripped the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles turned white. Because she was remembering Ellie's 4th birthday. There had been cake then, too. A doll. Laughter bright and clear. It had been her daughter's last birthday, though she hadn't known it at the time. Connor noticed. He came to stand beside Harper without speaking. He simply stood there, his silent presence a way of saying he understood, he saw, and she wasn't alone. Harper blinked back her tears and gave him a small nod of gratitude. As the party wound down, Connor mentioned something quietly. "Aunt Victoria called yesterday," he said. "She asked if we were okay." Harper looked at him. "What did you tell her?" He shrugged. "I told her we're fine, but I don't think she believed me." The words lingered in the air, a reminder that the threat remained, that the 2-month deadline Victoria had given was ticking away. That evening, after the children had gone upstairs, Harper stood on the porch looking at the stars. The sky was clear, scattered with countless points of light against velvet black. She heard footsteps behind her, and knew it was Killian before he spoke. "I know today was hard for you," he said, standing beside her, gazing upward. Harper didn't deny it. "Rosie deserves happiness," she replied softly. "That's what matters most." Silence settled between them for a moment. Then Killian did something she hadn't expected. He reached out and took her hand, just a gentle, brief clasp, only a few seconds before he let go. But long enough for her to feel the warmth of his skin, long enough for her heart to stumble in her chest. "Thank you," he said, his voice low and sincere. "For everything." Then he turned and walked toward the cabin as he did every night. Yet his steps seemed lighter somehow, and he paused once more to glance back at her, before disappearing into the dark. Harper remained standing there, looking down at her hand. The place where Killian had touched her still felt warm. The atmosphere at the ranch shifted overnight. Harper sensed it the moment she woke the morning after Rosie's birthday. The number of guards had doubled. Men dressed in black patrolled the grounds with sharper eyes and tighter posture. Black SUVs remained stationed at the gates around the clock, and the crackle of radios drifted from different corners of the property. Something was happening, something dangerous, and she didn't need anyone to tell her it had to do with the name Santos she had heard whispered in the dark. That afternoon, when things appeared calm on the surface, Harper decided to take the children out into the backyard for some air. Connor sat beneath the old oak tree reading, while Rosie chased butterflies with her new doll tucked under her arm. Harper stood nearby, watching them, savoring a rare moment of peace. Then she saw it. A figure moving along the edge of the woods, far enough to be subtle, close enough to be wrong. Killian's guards wore black. This man wore gray, blending between tree trunks as though observing. Harper's heart quickened, but she didn't panic. She had lost too much in her life to mistake panic for usefulness. She walked calmly toward Connor, her voice steady. "Connor, take Rosie inside. Don't run, just walk." Connor looked at her once and understood immediately. No questions, no hesitation. He rose, took Rosie's hand, and led her toward the house with casual composure, as if they were only going in for a drink of water. Harper stayed where she was, eyes still on the tree line, then located the nearest guard and reported what she had seen, describing the man's position and direction precisely. The security team responded at once, sweeping the woods, but by the time they reached the area, the stranger had vanished as though he had never existed. Killian returned 20 minutes later. He entered like a storm, face carved from ice but eyes burning with alarm. It was the first time Harper had seen him truly afraid, not for himself, but for the people inside the house. He found her immediately and questioned her carefully. "What did you see? When? Where? How close?" Harper answered with calm clarity, omitting nothing. When she finished, Killian held her gaze a moment and nodded. "You didn't panic," he said, not as a question but as recognition. "Panic helps no one," she replied. Orders followed swiftly. "From now on, no one leaves the house without clearance. The children don't go outside alone. Every window locked after dark." He spoke in low, urgent tones with Hudson, before retreating to his study to make calls. When Killian left, Hudson lingered with Harper. He studied her with an unreadable expression. Before Catherine died, he was different. Hudson said quietly, "He used to make breakfast for the kids. He used to laugh. He used to live." Harper listened without interruption. "You're bringing him back," Hudson continued. "Don't leave." Harper looked at him. "I'm just the housekeeper." Hudson's mouth curved faintly, though his eyes remained serious. "We both know that's no longer true." Then he walked away to direct security, leaving her alone with thoughts she wasn't ready to untangle. She stood by the window watching dusk settle, wondering how deeply she had stepped into this world. That night, long after the house had fallen quiet, Harper woke thirsty. She slipped from bed and walked downstairs for water. As she passed Killian's study, she noticed something unusual. The door wasn't locked. It was slightly open, dim light spilling into the hallway. It was the first night in 14 months that Killian hadn't gone to the cabin. Harper paused and glanced through the narrow opening. Killian sat in the large leather chair by the window, the room otherwise dark, moonlight casting pale silver across his profile. He wasn't asleep. He simply sat there, watching the night, like a sentinel guarding the house. His back was straight, his shoulders rigid, as if waiting for something to happen. Harper understood. He hadn't gone to the cabin because he wanted to be near his children, near her, near the people he was trying to protect. He couldn't protect them from 50 meters away. And perhaps, after everything, he had finally realized that running from the house didn't help him escape grief. It only distanced him from those who needed him most. Harper didn't disturb him. She moved quietly to the kitchen, poured herself a glass of water, and returned to her room. Before she lay down, she glanced out the window toward the dark cabin resting alone in the field. She allowed herself a small, private smile. Tonight, the cabin was empty. And that meant more than any words ever could. It was 2 o'clock in the morning when the alarm tore through the silence. The siren shrieked sharp and merciless, slicing the night like a blade. Red lights flashed along the hallways, staining the walls in the color of danger. Harper shot upright in bed, her heart slamming against her ribs, survival instinct rising before her mind could catch up. Her door flew open. Killian stood there, his face carved from ice, his gray eyes burning. He was dressed in black from head to toe, and for a brief second, Harper caught the glint of something at his waist she didn't allow herself to dwell on. "Safe room," he said, clipped and decisive. "Now, take the kids." He offered no explanation. He didn't need to. His voice was cold, but his eyes said something entirely different. "No one will touch you." Then he turned and vanished into the chaos echoing from outside. Harper didn't waste a second. She ran to Connor's room first. The 14-year-old was awake instantly, eyes alert, too accustomed to emergencies for someone his age. Then she hurried to Rosie's room, lifting the sleepy child into her arms. Rosie blinked, confusion turning to fear as the siren wailed. "Harper," she whispered, trembling. "What's happening?" "It's all right, sweetheart," Harper murmured, steady though her pulse raced. "We're playing hide and seek." Hudson appeared at the end of the hall and motioned them forward. They rushed downstairs, through a hidden door behind a bookshelf Harper had never known existed. Beyond it, a narrow staircase led underground to a reinforced steel room, lit by dim emergency lights, lined with water containers and supplies. Hudson ushered them inside, gave Connor a quick set of instructions, then shut the heavy door. The lock engaged with a solid metallic finality. They were sealed away from whatever unfolded above. But the sounds reached them anyway. Gunfire cracked in the distance, sharp and brutal. Engines roared, glass shattered. Rosie began to cry, small shoulders shaking in Harper's arms. Harper held her tight and began speaking softly about the stars. "Do you know," she whispered, her tone calm and rhythmic, "that there are billions of stars in the sky? Each one is a sun, and around each sun there could be worlds with creatures we've never imagined." Connor stood near the door, gripping a baseball bat he'd grabbed on the way down. His hands trembled. Harper could see it clearly, but he didn't lower the bat. "I'll protect you, Rosie," he said, forcing steadiness into his voice. "You're safe." The gunfire raged, then faded, then fell silent. The quiet that followed felt heavier than the noise. 1 hour passed. Then 2. No footsteps, no voices, no knock at the door. Waiting became its own kind of torture, each minute stretching unbearably long. "Is Dad okay?" Rosie asked in a broken whisper, eyes red from crying. Harper swallowed hard. "He'll come back," she said. "He always comes back." She didn't know if it was true. She didn't know where Killian was or whether he stood uninjured. But she had to believe. Rosie needed her to believe. Connor needed her to believe. And she needed that belief to keep from collapsing. Then came the sound of metal against metal. The lock disengaging. Connor sprang to his feet, raising the bat, positioning himself in front of Harper and Rosie, like a thin but determined shield. The door opened. Killian stood there. His black shirt was torn at the shoulder, revealing a long cut along his arm. Blood dried into dark streaks. His face was smeared with dirt, his hair disheveled. But he was alive. He stepped into the room and saw them. Harper holding Rosie, Connor standing guard with a bat. Something broke in his eyes. He dropped to his knees before them without a word and pulled all three into his arms. Harper, Rosie, Connor, all of them. He held them fiercely, almost desperately, as though letting go might cause them to vanish. For the first time, they were inside his embrace. Like a family. "It's over," he said hoarsely. "You're safe now. I won't let anyone hurt you." Then he looked at Harper, eyes red, voice lower but unshakable. "Any of you." Harper felt the rapid beat of his heart through the fabric of his shirt, the heartbeat of a man who had fought the night to protect what mattered most. And in that moment, she understood something undeniable. She wasn't only the housekeeper anymore. She was part of this family, whether she was ready to admit it or not. In the days after the attack, the house changed completely. Not the slow change that had come before, not the gradual cracking of small fissures along the frozen walls, but something sudden and unmistakable, as if that terrible night had shattered every barrier Killian had built over the past 14 months. He no longer disappeared into his study or retreated to the cabin. Each morning he came downstairs for breakfast with the children, sitting at the head of the table, asking Connor about his schoolwork, listening as Rosie described her dreams in careful detail. Each evening he read to Rosie before bed, his voice low and slightly awkward from lack of practice. Yet he stayed there, seated beside his daughter, turning each page until her blue eyes drifted closed. Connor and his father began repairing the fence behind the house together. Not because the fence was in urgent need of repair, but because it gave them a way back to one another. Harper watched from the kitchen window as father and son stood side by side beneath the late afternoon sun, Killian hammering nails into place while Connor handed them over and steadied the boards. They did not speak much, only worked in silence. Yet it was a different kind of silence, one that felt steady and companionable, rather than strained with resentment. There was a moment Harper witnessed that she would never forget. Killian paused to show Connor how to drive the nail straight, then rested his hand on his son's shoulder. Just for a second, a small and almost fragile gesture. Connor did not pull away. He allowed his father's hand to remain there, even tilting his head slightly toward the touch, as though leaning into a warmth he had been without for far too long. 3 months. The deadline Harper had set for herself had come and gone. 3 months to cook, to clean, and then to leave. No attachments, no exceptions. That was the agreement she had signed with herself the day she arrived. That afternoon, Harper stood in her room, staring at the old suitcase in the corner. It remained where she had placed it on her first day, a thin layer of dust resting on its surface from weeks of neglect. She stepped forward, pulled it out, and laid it on the bed. 3 months, she whispered to herself. That was the agreement. Cook, clean, and then go. No attachments, no exceptions. She opened the suitcase and began folding her clothes one by one, placing them neatly inside. Her hands moved mechanically, as if working quickly enough might keep her from thinking, from feeling the quiet fracture spreading through her chest. The sound of her door opening made her stop. She turned her head and saw Rosie standing in the doorway. The child's wide blue eyes were rimmed with red, her lips trembling as she looked at the open suitcase, and then at Harper. "Are you leaving?" she asked in a voice no louder than a breath, filled with fear and quiet desperation. Harper froze, still holding a blouse, unable to move, unable to speak. "Please don't go," Rosie said, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I don't want you to leave. You're like—" She did not finish the sentence, but Harper understood. "You're like a mother, not a replacement for Catherine, never that, but someone warm, someone safe, someone who was here when she needed her." And Rosie was terrified of losing that all over again. The blouse fell from Harper's hand. She did not remember crossing the room, only that a moment later she was kneeling in front of Rosie, pulling the child into her arms, and she wept. She wept for Rosie, a little girl who had lost her mother and was afraid of losing someone else. She wept for Ellie, her own daughter, her small angel who had flown away and whom she would never stop missing. She wept for herself, for the foolish vow she had made never to love again, never to allow her heart to attach itself to anyone. She had failed. She had loved these 2 children without realizing it, had let them step into the barren chambers of her heart and plant something there. And now she could not leave. Not because of a paycheck, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she did not want to go. "I'm not going anywhere, sweetheart," she said through tears, holding Rosie tighter. "I promise." Rosie clung to her, small fingers gripping Harper's shirt just as she had clung during the storm. And they remained there, the 2 of them, a child who had lost her mother, and a mother who had lost her child, holding each other, and crying for what had been taken, and for what had somehow been found again. Harper rose, wiped the tears from Rosie's cheeks, then from her own. She walked to the suitcase on the bed, closed it, and pushed it back into the corner. It would stay there, gathering dust, no longer needed. She did not realize Killian was standing in the hallway, watching through the open doorway. He did not step inside. He did not speak. He simply stood there, watching her hold his daughter, watching her cry, watching her push the suitcase away. And his eyes said everything his mouth could not. Gratitude, relief, and something else, something warmer and deeper, something he was not yet ready to name but that had already begun to take root in his chest. The day of the hearing arrived sooner than Harper expected. She stood before the mirror in her room, smoothing the white blouse she had carefully ironed the night before, wondering when she had last set foot inside a courtroom. The last time had been during the probate proceedings after Jonathan died, when his family had taken everything she owned. This time was different. This time she was not walking in as a widow stripped of her life, but as part of a family fighting to remain together. Killian drove them all to the county family courthouse, an old red brick building set in the center of town. He wore a black suit and a white shirt, looking composed and solemn as ever. Yet Harper saw how tightly he gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles pale from the strain. Connor sat in the back seat, spine straight, face tense but resolute. Rosie sat beside him, one hand clutching her blonde-haired doll, the other wrapped tightly around Harper's hand, not letting go for the entire drive. The courtroom was smaller than Harper had imagined. There was no jury, no audience, only the judge seated behind a large wooden bench, and the 2 sides facing each other across a narrow aisle. Victoria was already there, dressed in an elegant gray suit, her hair neatly pinned back, her expression still cool and composed. Her attorney sat beside her. a middle-aged man with gold-rimmed glasses and a thick stack of files laid out before him. They looked as though they had prepared for this battle for months and were confident they would prevail. The hearing began. Victoria's attorney spoke first, his tone steady and clinical, as though reading from an indictment. He detailed Killian's questionable business dealings, his absence as a father for more than a year, the neglected state of the house and the children who had not been properly cared for. He presented evidence, old photographs of the house when it had been dusty and dim, statements from acquaintances describing how Killian had not slept inside the home, how the children had largely fended for themselves. Each word felt like a blade slicing through the air, and Harper saw Killian sit motionless, jaw clenched, offering no protest even though every accusation reflected the truth of what had once been. Then the judge turned to the children. She was a woman in her late 50s, silver hair framing a face marked by sharp intelligence but softened by compassion. She asked Connor and Rosie to step forward and address them in a voice both gentle and firm. "Connor, whom do you wish to live with?" Connor stood tall, his gray eyes so much like his father's, and answered with a steadiness that seemed to surprise even himself. "I want to stay with my father. He made mistakes. But he is changing. He is trying. We are a family again." The judge nodded and turned to Rosie. "And what about you, sweetheart?" Rosie tightened her grip on Harper's hand, her blue eyes lifting to meet the judge's without fear. "I love my daddy. I love Harper. I want to stay home. Home is where they are." A hush fell over the courtroom. The judge then looked to Harper and asked about the current condition of the household. Harper spoke calmly and honestly, describing the house as it was now, clean and filled with light, the family dinners, Killian reading to Rosie every night, Connor and his father repairing the fence together, the sound of laughter returning to walls that had once known only silence. Victoria sat listening, and Harper noticed something shift in her expression. The cold judgment faded, replaced by something closer to surprise, perhaps recognition, as though a wall inside her had begun to crumble. Victoria's attorney leaned toward her and whispered urgently, likely reminding her of strategy, but she dismissed him with a small, decisive gesture. Then she rose to her feet. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. "I withdraw the petition," Victoria said, her voice steady though something beneath it trembled. Silence followed. The judge raised her brows. Victoria's attorney stared at her in disbelief. "I only wanted them to be safe," Victoria continued, her gaze resting on Connor and Rosie. "And I can see now that they are safe." She turned to Harper, her blue eyes so like Catherine's but no longer cold. "Take care of them. They are all I have left of my sister." Harper nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "I will. I promise." The hearing concluded swiftly after that. The judge ruled that Killian would retain custody, and they stepped out of the courthouse into the warm glow of late afternoon sunlight. Connor and Rosie ran ahead, and for the first time Harper saw them running and laughing like ordinary children, no longer carrying the heavy weight of fear on their shoulders. Harper moved to follow, but Killian stopped. He stood there in front of the courthouse doors and looked at her with the gray eyes she had learned to read over the past months. Then he reached for her hand and took it openly, without hesitation, without concealment. "Stay," he said, his voice low and sincere. "Not as a housekeeper. Stay with me, with the children, as family." Harper did not answer with words. She simply tightened her hold on his hand, feeling the warmth of his scarred and calloused palm, and that was all the answer either of them needed. 6 months after the court hearing, the Ashford house no longer resembled the place Harper had first stepped into on that uncertain day. Every window stood open, sunlight pouring into every corner, no heavy curtains drawn shut, no shadows lingering in forgotten edges of the rooms. Rosie's laughter rang out from the garden. Connor's voice teasing his sister drifted through the air. And each morning the steady sound of Killian's footsteps descended the staircase as he came down to breakfast with his family. The house had learned how to breathe again, and so had the people within it. One bright morning Harper stood in the kitchen with her mother's recipe notebook open before her. But today she did not turn to the familiar pages she used so often. Instead, she flipped to a page she had avoided for 4 long years, a page that had always torn at her heart the moment she saw it. Corn cake with star anise. Ellie's favorite. Harper's hands trembled slightly as she began measuring the ingredients. Cornmeal, sugar, butter, star anise. The sweet fragrance slowly filled the kitchen, and memories came rushing back like water breaking through a dam. Ellie standing on her little stool, flour dusted across her nose, giggling while her mother wiped her face clean. "Mommy, I love this smell the most. It smells like love. Harper had not made this recipe in 4 years, not because she had forgotten. She had not dared to remember. Each time she thought of it, she saw Ellie's smile, felt again those bright days before illness stole everything away. But today she was ready. Ready to remember without drowning. Ready to honor without collapsing beneath the weight of grief. Small footsteps sounded at the doorway, and Rosie appeared, her blue eyes bright with curiosity. She had grown in these 6 months, speaking more, laughing more. "What are you making, Harper?" she asked. Harper smiled and pulled the tall stool beside the counter. "I'm baking. Would you like to help?" Rosie climbed up and stood beside her, as she had so many times before, stirring the batter carefully under Harper's guidance. Before long, a smudge of flour dusted the tip of Rosie's nose, and both of them burst into laughter. "Is this your special recipe?" Rosie asked, tilting her head. Harper paused for a moment, then nodded. "It was my daughter's favorite." Rosie stopped stirring, her blue eyes widening. "You have a daughter?" "I had one," Harper said gently, her voice no longer breaking the way it once had. "Her name was Ellie. She's in heaven now, like your mother." Rosie grew quiet, thinking with the solemn concentration of a 6-year-old trying to grasp something too large for her years. Then she looked up with hopeful certainty. "Maybe they're friends up there. Maybe they're baking cookies together." Harper smiled, her eyes glistening though she did not cry. "Maybe they are, sweetheart. Maybe they are baking together." Connor sat at the table working on his homework, occasionally glancing toward the two of them with a softness far removed from the guarded boy Harper had first met. The sound of a car pulling into the drive signaled Killian's return. He had begun withdrawing from the darker edges of his work, gradually handing more responsibility to Hudson, choosing instead to spend his time at home. He stepped into the kitchen, inhaled deeply, then came up behind Harper and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin lightly on her shoulder. "That smells incredible," he murmured warmly near her ear. "What's the occasion?" "Remembering someone I love," Harper replied, still stirring, leaning her head back against him for a brief second. Later that afternoon, after the cake had been baked and shared, Harper walked into the backyard carrying 2 small flowering plants. She chose a quiet corner where the late sun poured down and the small lake shimmered in the distance. She knelt and began digging, placing the first plant into the soil and pressing the earth firmly around its roots. For Ellie, footsteps approached behind her. Connor stood there holding a small shovel, his expression serious, though his eyes were gentle. "Can I plant one for Mom?" he asked. Harper nodded, warmth spreading through her chest. "Of course." Rosie ran over with a little watering can, her dress already smudged with dirt from an afternoon of play. "I want to help too." Killian stood beside them, not digging, simply watching, but he was there, present, part of the moment, just as he had become part of this family. The 4 of them stood before the 2 small beds of flowers as the sun dipped low, painting the horizon in shades of orange and rose. One bed for Ellie, one for Catherine, one for those who had gone, one for those who remained. "We don't forget them," Harper said softly, her voice steady and sure. "We carry them with us, and we keep living, because that's what they would want." Rosie held Harper's hand with one hand and Killian's with the other. Connor stood beside his father, their shoulders touching. And in the Montana sunset, 4 souls, once broken in different ways, stood together. Not a perfect family, but a family all the same, their own. 1 year later, it was an ordinary Sunday morning at the Ashford Ranch. Yet nothing felt ordinary to Harper as she stood in the sunlit kitchen preparing breakfast for her family. The scent of bacon and fried eggs filled the air. Rosie's laughter drifted in from the living room where she was playing with Connor, and Killian's footsteps sounded on the staircase as he came down to join them. The table was set for 5 instead of 4, because today they had a guest. Victoria stepped into the house wearing a smile that, a year ago, Harper would never have imagined seeing on her face. The cold scrutiny was gone. The threats and court documents were gone. Now she was Aunt Victoria, visiting every week, bringing small gifts and stories about their mother. Today she carried an old leather-bound photo album, its cover worn soft with time. "I thought the children should have this," Victoria said as she placed it on the table. "These are photographs of Catherine when she was little." Rosie climbed onto her chair at once, pulling the album toward her and turning the pages with the eager curiosity of a 7-year-old. "Did Mommy get scared of storms like I do?" she asked, pointing at a photograph of Catherine as a teenager. Victoria laughed softly, a sound touched with memory. Very much. She used to crawl under the bed whenever there was thunder. Connor leaned closer, his gaze settling on a photograph of Catherine smiling brightly beneath the sun. She looks so happy, he said quietly. Victoria glanced toward Killian and Harper, seated side by side, and a gentle smile crossed her face. Catherine would have liked you, Harper. My sister always said Killian needed someone who could pull him back out of the dark. Breakfast continued with laughter and stories of Catherine, memories that could now be spoken without reopening wounds too raw to bear. Victoria stayed until nearly noon, then drove away after promising to return the following week. When the sound of her car faded, Harper stepped onto the porch and looked out across the ranch bathed in morning light. The green fields stretched toward the horizon, cattle grazed peacefully in the distance, and the 2 small flower beds at the edge of the garden bloomed in bright color. She thought of the old suitcase she had once brought with her, the one packed with a vow never to grow attached. It was somewhere in storage now, gathering dust, forgotten. She no longer needed it. Killian came out onto the porch and stood beside her, his shoulder brushing hers. They remained there in a companionable silence, the kind shared by people who no longer needed words to understand one another. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. Harper kept her eyes on the house she had once entered as a stranger, the house that had become her home. That some houses do not just need someone to cook and clean, they need someone to teach them how to breathe again. "And what about you?" Killian asked gently. Harper turned toward him and smiled, the first smile in many years that felt entirely unburdened. "I needed them to teach me how to live again." Killian took her hand, his rough, warm palm closing around hers. They stood together, looking out over the endless green fields where 2 children ran laughing, their voices bright in the wind. In the end, it was never about what they had lost. It was about what they could still plant and grow together. Harper and Killian's story reminds us that even when life drives us into its darkest corners, light remains if we are brave enough to open our hearts to it. Family is not always those bound by blood, but sometimes those who find one another among the broken pieces and choose to mend together. Love does not mean forgetting the ones we have lost. It means carrying them within our hearts and continuing to live in the way they would have wanted. How did this story touch your heart? Have you ever felt as though you lost everything, only to discover hope where you least expected it? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. We would truly value hearing your stories and reflections. If this story brought you even a small measure of warmth, please consider subscribing to our channel, liking this video, and sharing it with those you love, so that we may continue bringing meaningful stories to you each day. Thank you sincerely for listening until the very end. We wish you and your family health, joy, and peace each day. Goodbye, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video.